Welcome back to Her Voice Story. They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that greed is thicker than blood. My name is Willow Backer, and at 58, I thought I knew my daughter better than anyone. I was wrong. What she did to me in front of my own neighbors was unforgivable. But what I did back? That was legendary. The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday in my perfectly manicured suburban paradise. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint my garden in shades of gold and amber, my hands wrapped around a cup of Ethiopian coffee that cost more per pound than most people spent on groceries in a week. At 58, I'd learned to appreciate life's finer things. Not because I was spoiled, but because I'd earned every luxury through decades of careful investments, smart business decisions, and the kind of strategic thinking that had turned a modest inheritance into a $1.6 million estate in one of Connecticut's most exclusive neighborhoods. My reflection in the window showed a woman who'd aged like fine wine. Silver blonde hair fell in soft waves past my shoulders, emerald eyes that captivated 3 husbands and buried 2 of them, and the kind of bone structure that made strangers assume I'd been a model in my younger years. I maintained my figure with religious dedication to yoga and Pilates, and my skin glowed with the radiance that only came from expensive serums and the confidence of a woman who'd never doubted her own worth. The doorbell chimed at exactly 9 a.m., its melodic tone echoing through my marble foyer. I glanced at the security monitor and smiled. My daughter Sarah's patrol car sat in my circular driveway, gleaming black and white against the pristine asphalt. Sarah was my pride and joy, a 34-year-old police sergeant who'd worked her way up through the ranks with determination I'd inherited from me. Tall and athletic with my green eyes and her father's dark hair, she commanded respect wherever she went. Beside her stood Marcus, a man I'd never quite warmed to, despite trying for the sake of family harmony. I opened the door with genuine warmth, still believing in the fairy tale of family loyalty. Sweetheart, what a lovely surprise! I reached out to embrace my daughter, but something in her posture made me pause. She stood rigid, her hand resting on her duty belt in a way that seemed more official than familial. Hello, Mother. Her voice carried a formality that sent the first chill of unease down my spine. We need to talk. Of course, darling. Come in, I'll make some coffee. Actually, Marcus interrupted, his voice louder than necessary, we think it's better if we talk out here, in the open, where people can see. I glanced around and noticed for the first time that several of my neighbors had emerged from their houses. Mrs. Peterson was watering plants that clearly didn't need watering. The Johnsons were suddenly very interested in checking their mailbox. Even old Mr. Chen had found urgent yard work that required his immediate attention. I don't understand, I said, though a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in my mind. Mother, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone she used for suspects, we're concerned about your mental state. You've been making some questionable decisions lately. Questionable decisions? I repeated, genuinely confused. What are you talking about? Marcus stepped forward, his presence aggressive and intimidating. At 6'2" with the build of a former college football player, he'd always used his size to make people uncomfortable. Today was no exception. The spending, Willow, the paranoid phone calls, the way you've been acting erratic and unstable. His voice carried across the yard, ensuring every neighbor could hear. We can't stand by and watch you destroy yourself. I haven't. Yes, you have, Sarah interrupted, her hand moving to her handcuffs. And as a law enforcement officer, I have a duty to protect citizens who can't protect themselves, even when that citizen is my own mother. The metallic click of handcuffs seemed to echo like gunshots in the morning air. I stared at the silver restraints in my daughter's hands, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Sarah, what are you doing? For your own protection, Mother, you're clearly not capable of making rational decisions about your finances or your safety. This is insane. Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone addressing a mental patient. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." "I will not." The words came out sharper than I had intended, and I saw several neighbors lean closer, straining to hear every word. That's when Marcus made his first mistake. His first miscalculation in what I would later realize was a carefully orchestrated performance. He grabbed my arm roughly, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The push came without warning. His hands slammed into my shoulders, sending me stumbling backward towards my front door. I caught myself against the frame, my silk blouse torn at the shoulder, my dignity shattered in front of people I'd known for years. "She's having an episode," he shouted, for the benefit of our audience. "She's been threatening people, making wild accusations, spending money on crazy schemes." The handcuffs clicked around my wrists with a sound that would haunt my dreams for months to come. The metal was cold against my skin, a physical manifestation of the betrayal that was slowly sinking into my consciousness. "This is for your own good," Sarah said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "We've already spoken to a lawyer about having you declared incompetent. The paperwork is ready." Paperwork! Marcus produced a folder from his car, thick with legal documents that had clearly been prepared in advance. "Asset protection forms. We'll manage your finances until you're better." I looked at the papers through the haze of shock and humiliation. Property transfer documents, power of attorney forms, a petition for guardianship that painted me as a delusional woman who'd lost touch with reality. "All you have to do is sign," Sarah said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "We'll take care of everything, the house, the investments, all of it. You won't have to worry about making any more bad decisions." The neighbors were pretending not to stare, but I could feel their eyes on me like laser beams. Mrs. Peterson's watering can hung forgotten in her hand. The Johnsons stood frozen by their mailbox. Mr. Chen's rake lay abandoned on his lawn. I was being publicly humiliated, stripped of my dignity and my agency in front of people who'd respected me for years. The perfect suburban matriarch reduced to a handcuffed woman being lectured by her own child about mental incompetence. And in that moment, standing there with silver chains around my wrists and my torn blouse hanging off my shoulder, I made a decision that would change everything. I smiled. Not the warm, maternal smile I'd been giving my daughter for 34 years. Not the polite social smile I used at charity functions and neighborhood barbecues. This was something else entirely. A smile that came from a place deep inside me that I'd never accessed before. A place where patience lived alongside vengeance, where strategic thinking merged with righteous fury, where a woman who'd been underestimated her entire life finally decided to show the world what she was truly capable of. "All right," I said, my voice steady and calm despite the handcuffs and the audience and the complete destruction of my morning peace. "I'll sign." Sarah's relief was visible, but Marcus looked suspicious. He expected more fight, more drama, more of the erratic behavior they'd been advertising to the neighbors. "Just like that?" he asked. "Just like that." I met his gaze directly, letting him see something in my eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. "After all, family is everything. Isn't that what you always say?" The papers were signed on my own front porch, my signature shaky because of the handcuffs, but legally binding nonetheless. With each stroke of the pen, I signed away my beautiful home, my financial independence, my entire life as I'd known it. But I also signed something else into existence, a plan that was already forming in the depths of my mind, as intricate and beautiful as the garden they were stealing from me. "There," I said, handing back the papers. "Is that everything?" "That's everything," Marcus said, unable to hide his satisfaction. Sarah unlocked the handcuffs, and I rubbed my wrists where the metal had left red marks. "I suppose I should pack some things." "We'll help you," Sarah said, finally meeting my eyes. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt, a shadow of the daughter who used to curl up in my lap during thunderstorms, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold efficiency of a woman who'd just stolen her mother's life and was eager to make it official. As we walked into my house, my former house, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. My hair was mussed, my blouse torn, my makeup smeared. I looked like a victim, but behind my eyes, something else was awakening. Something patient and calculating and absolutely merciless. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully humiliated and destroyed me, taken everything I'd worked for, and reduced me to a helpless woman dependent on their charity. They had no idea they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Beautiful souls, I need you to buckle up because this story is about to take you on a roller coaster of emotions that will leave you breathless. If you're feeling that fire in your chest right now, that righteous anger on Willa's behalf, then you're exactly where you need to be. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Trust me, what Willow does next will restore your faith in justice and remind you that underestimating the wrong woman is always a fatal mistake. Hit that notification bell and get ready for a masterclass in patience, planning, and the sweetest revenge you've ever witnessed. The apartment they'd arranged for me was a study in deliberate humiliation. A cramped one-bedroom in a converted Victorian downtown with thin walls, creaky floors, and a view of the dumpsters behind Tony's Pizza. The rent was exactly 1/4 of what my property taxes used to be, which I suppose was their idea of irony. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, surrounded by the 3 suitcases that represented the entirety of my permitted possessions, and let the full weight of my situation sink in. No walk-in closets, no garden where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the world wake up, just a small space with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made my reflection look corpse pale in the bathroom mirror. "It's temporary," Sarah had said, as she'd helped me carry my bags upstairs. Her voice hollow with a kind of guilt that wasn't quite strong enough to change her mind, but was certainly strong enough to make her uncomfortable. "Just until you're feeling better." Marcus had been less diplomatic. "Honestly, Willow, this is probably better for you anyway. The big house was just too much to maintain, too much temptation to make bad financial decisions." I nodded and smiled and thanked them for their concern, playing the role of the grateful, confused woman who was relieved to have her loving family taking care of her. Inside, I was cataloging every word, every expression, every tell that revealed their true motivations. They wanted me grateful. They wanted me diminished. They wanted me to disappear quietly into this little box they constructed for me, to fade away like an embarrassing family secret while they enjoyed the fruits of their theft. Instead, I spent my first week in exile doing what I'd always done best: research. The public library became my second home, its Wi-Fi connection my window into the digital paper trail that would either damn my daughter and her husband or exonerate them completely. I sat at a corner table for hours each day, my silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses perched on my nose, looking all the world like a harmless older woman catching up on her email. The picture that emerged was more damning than I dared hope. Marcus Chun. I never bothered to investigate my son-in-law's background before the wedding, trusting Sarah's judgment like the naive mother I had apparently been, had a history that read like a criminal justice textbook. 3 previous business ventures, all failed under suspicious circumstances, a pattern of relationships with older women that had ended with mysterious financial transfers, a bankruptcy filing that had been dismissed on technicalities that seemed too convenient to be coincidental, and, most interestingly of all, a sealed juvenile record that had been expunged but left just enough digital footprints for someone who knew where to look. Sarah's record was more complex but equally troubling. 5 excessive force complaints in the past 2 years, all dismissed due to lack of credible evidence. A pattern of targeting elderly citizens for wellness checks that often resulted in protective custody and asset freezes. A reputation among defense attorneys as someone who bent rules just far enough to avoid breaking them. My daughter, I realized, with a mixture of pride and horror, had been running long cons on vulnerable seniors for years. Marcus wasn't her husband, he was her business partner, and I had been their biggest score yet. By the end of my second week in the apartment, I had compiled a file that would have made a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Bank records, property transfers, witness statements, digital communications, everything I needed to prove that my protection had been a carefully orchestrated fraud. But proving it and using it were two different things entirely. I sat at my tiny kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, legal documents spread before me like tarot cards revealing an inevitable future, and realized that I had a choice to make. I could take everything I discovered to the authorities immediately, file complaints, press charges, demand justice through official channels. It would be the reasonable, expected response of a victim seeking redress through proper legal means. Or I could do something else entirely. I poured myself a glass of wine, a modest Pinot Grigio that was all my new budget allowed, and considered my options. Outside my window, the neon sign from Tony's Pizza cast red and blue shadows across my wall, a disco of desperation that perfectly matched my surroundings. The reasonable path would take months, maybe years. There would be investigations, hearings, appeals. Sarah would claim she'd acted in my best interests. Marcus would hire expensive lawyers and disappear behind legal technicalities. Even if I won, the victory would be hollow, clinical, unsatisfying. The other path would take longer, but would be infinitely more rewarding. I thought about the handcuffs, cold and humiliating around my wrists. I thought about Marcus's hands shoving me backward, the calculated violence of someone who'd done this before. I thought about the neighbors watching, their faces a mixture of shock and secret satisfaction at seeing the perfect Willow backer brought low. Most of all, I thought about Sarah's voice as she'd clicked those handcuffs into place. "This is for your own good, Mother." No. The reasonable path was for reasonable people dealing with reasonable opponents. What Sarah and Marcus had done to me was personal. It deserved a personal response. I opened my laptop and began making lists. The first list contained every person who'd witnessed my public humiliation. Neighbors, delivery drivers, random joggers who had happened to be passing by, people who would remember seeing a respected woman dragged away in handcuffs by her own daughter. The second list contained every professional contact I'd made over 40 years of business dealings: lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, bankers, people who knew my reputation and would be shocked to learn about my alleged mental incompetence. The third list contained every piece of information I'd gathered about Sarah and Marcus's other activities: names, dates, amounts, locations. The building blocks of a case that would destroy not just their current scheme, but their entire criminal enterprise. But the fourth list was the most important one. It contained the names of people who owed me favors, big favors. The kind of debts that accumulated over decades of strategic kindness, perfectly timed business referrals, and the occasional discreet financial assistance during someone else's moment of crisis. Judge Patricia Holloway, whose daughter's drug charges had quietly disappeared after I'd connected her with the right rehabilitation program. Attorney Michael Brennan, whose real estate empire had launched with a loan I provided when no bank would touch his credit. Detective Rachel Martinez, whose wrongful termination lawsuit had been resolved favorably after I'd provided character references and connected her with the right legal representation. Journalist Diana Foster, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into municipal corruption had been made possible by financial documents I'd obtained through my business connections. People who understood the concept of reciprocal loyalty. People who both had the power and the motivation to help me turn my carefully gathered evidence into something resembling justice. Over the next week, I began making phone calls. Not the desperate calls of a woman seeking help, but the careful, measured conversations of someone calling in markers that had been accumulating interest for years. "Patricia, it's Willow Backer." I hope you're well. I was wondering if you might have time for lunch next week. I have something I'd like to discuss with you, something that might interest your sense of justice. Michael, Willowbacker, I know it's been too long. Listen, I've come across a rather interesting legal situation, a case that might appeal to your particular expertise in asset recovery. Rachel, darling, how are you? I was just thinking about our conversation last year regarding patterns of elder abuse within law enforcement. I may have stumbled across something that would fascinate you. Diana, it's Willow. Remember that story you mentioned about wanting to investigate corruption in suburban police departments? Well, I might have exactly what you're looking for. Each conversation was brief, casual, the kind of chat old friends might have over coffee. But beneath the pleasantries, I was weaving the threads of a web that would eventually entangle my daughter and her husband in ways they couldn't imagine. By the end of my third week in exile, the pieces were beginning to move. Judge Holloway had agreed to review my evidence off the record and had expressed shock at what appeared to be a clear case of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Attorney Brennan had taken on my case pro bono and was already filing preliminary motions that would make life very uncomfortable for Sarah and Marcus. Detective Martinez had opened an unofficial inquiry into patterns of suspicious wellness checks and protective custody cases involving elderly citizens. And journalist Diana Foster had begun researching a story about corruption in suburban police departments, with particular focus on a certain sergeant who seemed to have unusual success in protecting senior citizens from their own financial decisions. But the most important conversation had been with someone whose name wasn't on any of my lists. Dr. Emily Rhodes, a forensic psychiatrist whose expert testimony could destroy the entire foundation of Sarah and Marcus's case against me. Willow, she'd said, after reviewing the documentation of my mental incompetence, I've seen healthier psychological profiles from people in active psychosis. Whoever evaluated you for this guardianship petition was either grossly incompetent or deliberately falsifying their findings. Which do you think it was? Given the financial incentives involved, I'd say deliberate falsification. And that, my dear, is a felony. I hung up the phone and poured myself another glass of wine, this one a slightly better vintage that I'd allowed myself to celebrate the progress. Outside my window, Tony's pizza sign flickered and hummed, casting its red and blue shadows across my legal documents. Sarah and Marcus thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully isolated me, stripped me of resources and credibility, reduced me to a pathetic figure dependent on their charity. They had no idea that every day they delayed in checking on their supposedly incompetent victim was another day I spent building the case that would destroy them. Some battles were won with immediate, overwhelming force. Others were won with patience, preparation, and the absolute certainty that justice delayed was not justice denied. It was justice perfected. I raised my glass to the neon glow outside my window and smiled the same smile I'd given them on my front porch 3 weeks earlier. They taught me something valuable about the nature of family loyalty. Now, I was going to teach them something about the consequences of underestimating the wrong woman. The law office of Brennan and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise, its marble lobby and crystal chandeliers announcing to anyone who entered that justice here came at premium prices. I sat in Michael Brennan's corner office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, and felt a familiar sense of satisfaction at being back in my natural environment. "Willow," Michael said, settling his considerable frame behind a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. "I have to admit, when you called me 3 weeks ago, I was expecting something far less elaborate." He gestured to the files spread across his conference table. 3 boxes worth of documents, photographs, bank records, and recorded phone calls that painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple family theft. "You've built a RICO case against your own daughter." "I've built a case for justice," I corrected, though I couldn't deny the pride in my voice. What they did to me wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern that's been going on for years. Michael picked up one of the files, a compilation of Sarah's wellness checks over the past 18 months. 12 elderly citizens, all living alone, all targeted after family members or neighbors had expressed concerns about their financial decisions. All of them had ultimately been placed under protective guardianship arrangements that had resulted in their assets being managed by court-appointed conservators. Conservators who, coincidentally, had all used the same psychiatric evaluator to assess mental competence. The same evaluator who had declared me incompetent based on a 15-minute phone conversation and a review of financial records that had been carefully edited to remove any evidence of sound decision-making. Dr. Russell Camden, I said, noting where Michael's attention had focused. Licensed psychiatrist, certified forensic evaluator, and apparently a man with a very flexible relationship with professional ethics. His evaluations are textbook examples of confirmation bias, Michael agreed, flipping through the psychiatric reports. Every single assessment reaches the same conclusion, regardless of the patient's actual mental state, because he's not actually evaluating mental competence. He's providing legal cover for theft. The pattern was breathtakingly simple once you understood it. Sarah would identify vulnerable targets, usually wealthy elderly citizens with minimal family connections or protective oversight. She'd arrange for concerned calls to be made about their behavior, often using Marcus's charm to befriend neighbors or service providers who could provide credible witness testimony. Then came the wellness checks, the emergency protective custody, the expedited competency hearings with predetermined outcomes. The victims would find themselves stripped of legal authority over their own lives, their assets transferred to conservators who charged exorbitant fees for the privilege of managing wealth that was systematically depleted through necessary expenses and administrative costs. By the time the victims realized what was happening, they were legally powerless to stop it. And if they tried to fight back, their protests were simply additional evidence of their mental instability. "How many people do you think they've done this to?" Michael asked. "Based on what I can prove, at least 30 over the past 5 years. Based on what I suspect?" I shrugged. "Probably twice that number." "Jesus, Vu. We're talking about millions of dollars. We're talking about lives destroyed," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "People like Mrs. Eleanor Carrington, 83 years old, former mathematics professor, who supposedly became incompetent the week after she decided to change her will to leave her estate to her grandchildren instead of her estranged son. The son who just happened to be dating a police officer named Sarah Chin. The very same Mrs. Carrington died in state care 6 months later, alone and confused, while her estate was systematically liquidated to pay for her protection." Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph of Mrs. Carrington that I'd included in the file, a dignified woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, taken just months before Sarah had destroyed her life. "You know," he said finally, "most people would just have filed a complaint with Internal Affairs and hoped for the best. Most people aren't me." "No, they certainly aren't." He leaned back in his chair, a predatory smile crossing his features. "So, what exactly do you want me to do with all this?" "I want you to file a civil lawsuit that will strip them of every asset they have accumulated through this scheme. I want criminal charges that will put them both in prison for the rest of their productive lives. And I want it done in a way that ensures every victim they've targeted knows they have legal recourse. That's a tall order." "You owe me a tall favor." Michael's smile widened. "Yes, I do. And I always pay my debts." He stood and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the city like a general surveying a battlefield. "The civil case will be straightforward. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud. With the evidence you've gathered, we can probably get treble damages plus attorney fees. And the criminal case, that's trickier. We need the district attorney to take it seriously. And DACEs are notoriously reluctant to prosecute police officers. Even corrupt ones? Especially corrupt ones. Bad cops make DAs look bad. And looking bad is career suicide in politics." I joined him at the window, watching traffic flow through the streets below like blood through arteries. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably finishing her shift, confident that her mother was safely contained in a dingy apartment, too broken and humiliated to cause any trouble. What if the case came to the DA's attention through unofficial channels? I asked. You mean if someone leaked your evidence to the media first, created enough public outrage that the DA had no choice but to investigate? I mean if someone happened to provide that evidence to a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who specialized in exposing municipal corruption. Michael's reflection in the window grinned back at me. That someone wouldn't happen to be Diana Foster, would it? Diana's always been very interested in stories about law enforcement overreach. And you've always been very good at providing information to interested journalists. I've always believed in the public's right to know. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city pulse with life below us. I thought about all the people who are currently going about their daily routines, unaware that their lives could be destroyed by a daughter's handcuffs and a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. People like I'd been just a month ago. There's one more thing, I said. I want to personally attend every hearing, every deposition, every moment of their legal destruction. I want them to see my face when their world comes crashing down. That's unusually vindictive for you, Willow. No, I said, thinking about the cold metal of handcuffs around my wrists, about Marcus's hands shoving me backward, about the neighbors watching my humiliation with secret satisfaction. That's unusually honest for me. Michael returned to his desk and began organizing the files into neat stacks. I'll need a few weeks to prepare the initial filings. Civil complaint first, then we'll coordinate with the criminal investigation. How long before they know what's coming legally? I have to serve them with papers before any court appearances. But practically, he grinned, they won't know what hit them until it's too late to stop it. I gathered my purse and stood to leave, feeling lighter than I had since the morning of my public humiliation. For the first time in a month, I had hope. Not just for my own vindication, but for justice that extended far beyond my personal grievances. Michael, I said, pausing at his office door. When this is over, remind me to tell you about the time I helped a young lawyer get his first commercial real estate loan. I remember that time very well, Willow. It's why I'm taking this case. No, I said, meeting his eyes directly. You're taking this case because Sarah and Marcus made one fatal mistake. What mistake was that? They assumed that because I'm their victim, I must be everyone's victim. They never considered the possibility that I might be someone else's biggest asset. I left his office with the satisfaction of knowing that the next phase of my plan was in motion. The legal machinery was beginning to turn slowly and inexorably, like the gears of a clock that had been carefully wound and set to strike at exactly the right moment. But legal justice was only part of what I had in mind for my daughter and her husband. Some lessons could only be learned through public humiliation, and I was about to teach them both a masterclass in the subject. The Riverside Country Club had been my social sanctuary for 23 years, its manicured golf course and elegant dining room serving as the backdrop for countless business deals, charity events, and the kind of casual conversations that shaped the political and economic landscape of our community. Now, as I walked through its familiar halls wearing a simple black dress instead of my usual designer ensembles, I felt like an actress returning to a stage where she'd once been the star, but was now relegated to playing a supporting character. The difference in how people treated me was subtle, but unmistakable. Conversations that would have naturally included me now took place just beyond my hearing. Invitations that would have been automatic now required careful consideration of whether associating with me might damage someone's reputation. I was, after all, the woman who'd been publicly declared incompetent by her own daughter, the former socialite who'd been handcuffed in her own driveway and forced to sign away her assets to prevent further erratic behavior. At least that was the story Sarah and Marcus had been carefully spreading through our social circles. What they didn't realize was that their whisper campaign was providing me with the perfect opportunity to launch one of my own. Willow, darling, Margaret Thornton approached my table in the club's dining room, her expression a carefully calibrated mixture of sympathy and curiosity. I was so sorry to hear about your situation. Margaret was the wife of our local congressman and the unofficial queen of the country club's social hierarchy. Her opinion carried weight, and her gossip reached the right ears with remarkable efficiency. Thank you, Margaret. It's been challenging. I let my voice carry just the right note of brave resignation. But I'm learning to accept that sometimes family members make decisions they think are best, even when those decisions are based on incomplete information. Incomplete information? I glanced around the dining room as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned forward slightly. Well, I probably shouldn't say anything, but the psychiatric evaluation that declared me incompetent was based entirely on a phone call. The doctor never actually met me in person. Margaret's eyes widened. That seems unusual. I thought so too, especially since I'd been managing a multi-million-dollar investment portfolio successfully for decades. I shrugged with apparent resignation. But Sarah is a police officer and her husband has experience with these matters. I suppose they know more about mental health assessments than I do. Her husband has experience with mental health assessments? Oh, yes. Marcus has been involved in several cases where elderly people needed protection from their own poor judgment. He's quite knowledgeable about the process. I did mention that his knowledge came from running the same scam on multiple victims. That piece of information would come later, when Margaret and others were primed to receive it. How awful for you, though, Margaret said, her journalist's instincts clearly pinging, to have your own family question your competence? The hardest part, I said, dabbing at my napkin, is knowing that there are other families going through the same thing. Other elderly people who are being protected whether they need it or not. Other families, well, I shouldn't name names, but I've heard that several other people in town have had similar experiences recently. Wellness checks that turned into custody situations, competency evaluations that seemed rushed, assets that were transferred for protection purposes. Margaret was leaning forward now, her lunch forgotten. As the congressman's wife, she was always alert for potential scandals that might affect her husband's reputation or provide ammunition against his political opponents. That does sound concerning, she said carefully. I'm sure it's all perfectly legal, I said quickly. Sarah wouldn't be involved in anything improper, but it does make me wonder about the oversight mechanisms for these kinds of interventions. I left Margaret with just enough information to spark her curiosity without seeming like I was actively trying to damage Sarah's reputation. Over the next hour, I had similar conversations with 3 other influential women, each time sharing slightly different pieces of the puzzle while maintaining my role as the confused, vulnerable victim who was trying to understand what had happened to her. By the end of lunch, I was confident that Margaret and her friends would be discussing the concerning pattern of elderly people being declared incompetent under questionable circumstances. And because they were concerned citizens rather than bitter victims, their observations would carry far more weight than any direct accusations I might make. The beauty of a well-executed whisper campaign was that it appeared to generate spontaneously from multiple sources, creating the impression of widespread concern rather than targeted character assassination. Over the next 2 weeks, I attended every social function I could manage on my reduced budget. Church coffee hours, library fundraisers, neighborhood association meetings, anywhere I could have casual conversations with people who knew my reputation and would be shocked to learn about my alleged mental decline. At each event, I played my role perfectly, the dignified woman who was trying to accept her family's decision while privately struggling to understand how a 15-minute phone call could override decades of demonstrated competence. At each event, I played my role perfectly, the dignified woman who was trying to accept her family's decision while privately struggling to understand how a 15-minute phone call could override decades of demonstrated competence. I never directly criticized Sarah or Marcus. I never suggested that their motives were anything other than genuine concern for my well-being. Instead, I simply shared my confusion about the process, my surprise at the speed of the proceedings, and my concern that other families might be facing similar situations without adequate oversight. The effect was exactly what I had hoped for. Within a week, I began hearing reports of conversations taking place in circles I wasn't part of, questions being raised about the competency evaluation process, concerns being expressed about potential conflicts of interest when family members benefited financially from guardianship arrangements. Dr. Russell Camden's name began appearing in these conversations, not as an accused party, but as someone's professional practices might warrant closer examination. Questions were being asked about his relationship with local law enforcement, his evaluation methods, and the unusual consistency of his findings in cases involving police wellness checks. But the most satisfying development came during my third week of social reconnaissance. I was attending a charity auction for the Children's Hospital when I overheard a conversation between Judge Patricia Holloway and District Attorney Catherine Morrison. They were standing near the silent auction table speaking in the low tones that suggested serious professional discussion. "Pat, I keep hearing concerns about some of these expedited competency cases," Catherine was saying. "Multiple sources are suggesting there might be procedural irregularities." "I've been thinking the same thing," Patricia replied. "The Camden evaluations in particular seem formulaic, almost like he's working from a template rather than conducting genuine assessments. And there's the timing issue. These cases are moving through the system at an unusual pace, especially considering the complexity of the legal and financial arrangements involved. Catherine, what would you say to the idea of a systematic review? Not targeting any specific cases, but looking at patterns and procedures to ensure we're adequately protecting everyone's rights. I'd say it's exactly what we should be doing. In fact, I was planning to suggest something similar to you. I moved away from their conversation before either woman noticed my proximity, but I was smiling as I continued my tour of the auction items. The seed I had planted through my social network was taking root in exactly the right soil. Judge Holloway and D.A. Morrison were responding to gossip, or unsubstantiated accusations. They were responding to a pattern of concerns from multiple, respected sources, all pointing to the same conclusion. The system designed to protect vulnerable elderly citizens might be systematically failing in its mission. That evening, I called Diana Foster. "Diana, darling, how is your investigation into municipal corruption progressing?" "Slowly, but steadily. I'm finding some interesting patterns in the court records, but I need more concrete evidence of wrongdoing before I can publish anything definitive." "What kind of concrete evidence?" "Financial records showing improper monetary flows, documentation of procedural violations, testimony from victims who are willing to go on record." "Hypothetically speaking, what if someone had compiled exactly that kind of evidence? Someone who had personal experience with the system, but also access to information about other cases?" "Hypothetically speaking, I'd be very interested in reviewing that evidence, especially if it came from a source with unimpeachable credibility. And if that source happened to be someone who is currently a victim of the system but had previously been a respected member of the community, that would be ideal. A victim with standing and resources who could provide both personal testimony and broader documentation of systemic abuse. Diana, I think we should have lunch tomorrow." The next day, we met at a small cafe downtown, far from the country club and the social circles where our conversation might be observed or reported. I brought 3 file folders, carefully selected evidence that would support Diana's investigation without revealing the full scope of what I discovered. "My God, Willow," she said after reviewing the first folder, "this isn't just about your case. This is about dozens of cases." That's what I've been trying to tell people. But it's difficult when you're officially incompetent to manage your own affairs. These financial records show clear patterns of asset stripping, and the timeline on these competency evaluations, some of them were completed before the wellness checks were even conducted. Predetermination of outcomes does seem problematic from a due process standpoint. Diana was already taking notes, her reporter's instincts fully engaged. I'll need to verify these records independently, but if even half of this is accurate, we're looking at one of the largest elder abuse conspiracies in state history. Just remember, I said as we prepared to leave, I'm not the source of this information. I'm just a concerned citizen who happened to stumble across evidence of systemic problems while trying to understand what happened to me. Of course. But Diana, when this story breaks, you know what the retaliation is going to look like, don't you? I'm counting on it, I said with a smile that made Diana take a step backward. Because when someone retaliates against a victim, it confirms that the victim was onto something important. Over the next week, I watched the social landscape shift with the satisfaction of a chess master watching an opponent realize they'd been maneuvered into an impossible position. The Whisper campaign I'd launched was now generating its own momentum, spreading through channels I couldn't directly control, but could certainly influence. Questions about Sarah and Marcus's activities were being raised by people who had no idea they were repeating information I'd carefully seeded into their conversations. More importantly, those questions were reaching the ears of people who had the power to do something about the answers. Judge Holloway had quietly begun reviewing all competency cases that had come through her court in the past 2 years. D.A. Morrison had assigned a senior prosecutor to conduct a preliminary investigation into procedural irregularities in elder protection cases. And Diana Foster was conducting the kind of deep investigative research that had made her career. Sarah and Marcus had no idea that the ground was shifting beneath them. They were still operating under the assumption that they'd successfully isolated and neutralized their biggest threat. They were about to learn that isolating me was their second biggest mistake. Their biggest mistake had been assuming that because they'd taken away my house and my financial independence, they'd also taken away my power. But power, I'd learned over 40 years of business and social maneuvering, wasn't about what you owned. It was about who owed you favors, who trusted your judgment, and who would act on information you provided because they knew that information would be accurate, actionable, and devastating to anyone who deserved to be destroyed. Sarah had inherited my green eyes and my determination, but she never learned the most important lesson I could have taught her. Never underestimate a woman who spent decades building a network of allies, especially when that woman has just been given the ultimate motivation to use every connection she's ever made. Beautiful souls. Can you feel the walls closing in on Sarah and Marcus? Willow is playing chess while they're playing checkers, and every move she makes is setting them up for total destruction. If you're getting that delicious feeling of anticipation, that sense that justice is finally coming, then smash that like button and share the story with someone who needs to see what happens when you mess with the wrong mother. We're just getting started. The next chapter is going to show you exactly what happens when whispers become headlines. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, although Sarah and Marcus wouldn't realize its significance until much later. I was in my small apartment kitchen preparing my morning coffee with the kind of deliberate routine I developed to maintain sanity in my reduced circumstances, when my phone rang. Mrs. Backer, this is Detective Rachel Martinez with Internal Affairs. I was wondering if you might have time to speak with me about some concerns that have been brought to our attention. I set down my coffee cup with steady hands, though my heart was racing with anticipation. Of course, Detective. What kind of concerns? It would be better if we could discuss this in person. Would you be available to meet with me this afternoon? I suppose so, though I should mention that my daughter is a police officer and I've been declared incompetent to manage my own affairs. I'm not sure how helpful my testimony would be. Ma'am, your competency status doesn't affect your ability to provide information about events you witnessed or experienced. And frankly, some of the concerns we're investigating relate to the circumstances surrounding your situation. 2 hours later, I sat in a sterile conference room at the police headquarters across from Detective Martinez and her partner, Detective James Walsh. Both officers had the kind of weathered faces that came from years of dealing with humanity's worst impulses, and both were treating me with the careful respect reserved for someone whose credibility was in question, but whose information might be crucial. Mrs. Burr, Detective Martinez began, we've received multiple reports about irregularities in wellness checks and competency evaluations involving elderly citizens. Your name has come up in several of these reports. I'm not sure I understand. Are you investigating me? No, ma'am. We're investigating the procedures that led to your current legal status, specifically whether those procedures followed department policy and state law. Detective Walsh leaned forward, his voice gentle but direct. Mrs. Backer, can you walk us through exactly what happened on the morning you were placed in protective custody? For the next hour, I recounted the events of that morning with careful precision, describing every detail from Sarah's unusual formality to Marcus's physical aggression to the neighbors who had witnessed my humiliation. I showed them the bruises on my arms where Marcus had grabbed me, photographs I'd taken that same evening when the marks were fresh and dark. Did you at any time request police intervention or express concerns about your own safety or mental state? Detective Martinez asked. Never. I was completely unaware that anyone had concerns about my competence until the moment my daughter appeared at my door with handcuffs and the psychiatric evaluation that declared you incompetent. A 15-minute phone conversation with Dr. Camden. He asked me about my recent financial decisions, my living situation, and whether I felt safe in my home. When I mentioned that I'd been making some investment changes and considering downsizing my house, he apparently decided that constituted evidence of mental instability. The detectives exchanged glances that suggested this information was consistent with other reports they'd received. Mrs. Backer, Detective Walsh said carefully, are you aware of other cases where similar procedures were followed? I've heard rumors, conversations at social events about other families who've dealt with competency issues, but I don't have any direct knowledge of other cases. It was a careful answer that was technically true while omitting the extensive research I'd conducted. I was here to provide information about my own experience, not to present myself as an investigator who might have ulterior motives. One final question, Detective Martinez said. Do you believe the actions taken against you are motivated by genuine concern for your well-being, or do you think there might have been other factors involved? I paused as if considering the question seriously, though I'd been preparing for it since the moment I'd walked into the building. Detective, I want to believe that my daughter acted out of love and concern, but I can't ignore the fact that she and her husband benefited financially from having me declared incompetent. They now control assets worth nearly $2 million, and they've made it clear that they consider this arrangement permanent, even if I could demonstrate mental competence. They've told me that the legal process for reversing a competency determination is extremely difficult and expensive. Since I no longer have access to my own resources, I'm essentially trapped in this situation regardless of my actual mental state. The interview concluded with the detectives thanking me for my cooperation and promising to follow up if they needed additional information. As I left the police station, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that another piece of my plan had fallen into place. The internal affairs investigation would proceed according to its own timeline and methodology, but I'd provided them with exactly the information they needed to understand that my case wasn't an isolated incident of family concern gone wrong. It was part of a systematic pattern that deserved serious scrutiny. That evening, my phone rang again. Willow, it's Michael Brennan. I have some interesting news. Please tell me it's the kind of interesting that involves legal documents being filed? Better than that. It's the kind of interesting that involves other victims coming forward. Michael explained that word of my civil lawsuit had begun circulating through legal circles, and 3 other families had contacted his office with similar stories. Elderly parents who had been declared incompetent under questionable circumstances, assets that had been transferred to family members or court-appointed guardians, psychiatric evaluations that seemed designed to reach predetermined conclusions. We're looking at a class action lawsuit, Michael said. Multiple victims, a clear pattern of abuse, and enough evidence to put serious pressure on everyone involved. How does that affect my individual case? It strengthens it enormously. Individual cases can be dismissed as family disputes or isolated incidents, but a pattern of systematic abuse that gets the attention of prosecutors, regulators, and most importantly, juries. The second crack appeared 2 days later in the form of a phone call that Sarah made to my apartment. Mother, we need to talk. Her voice had lost the confident authority it had carried during my handcuffing. Now she sounded stressed, uncertain, almost vulnerable. Of course, darling. Is everything all right? Internal Affairs wants to interview me about your situation. They've been asking questions about my procedures, my documentation, whether I followed proper protocols. I'm sure you did everything correctly. Of course I did. But they're making it sound like I might have done something wrong, like I've violated your rights somehow. Sarah, you're a dedicated police officer. I'm sure any investigation will confirm that you acted appropriately. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more like the daughter I remembered from her childhood. Mother, did you did you file a complaint against me? Sarah, I've been declared incompetent to manage my own affairs. I don't think I'm legally capable of filing complaints against anyone. It was a perfectly crafted response that answered her question without technically lying. I hadn't filed a complaint, but I had provided information to people who were investigating complaints filed by others. But you've been talking to people. People have been asking questions about you, about your treatment, about whether you really needed protective intervention. People have been kind enough to check on me. Yes, when someone's situation changes dramatically, friends and neighbors naturally express concern. What kind of concern? The usual kind. Whether I'm adjusting well to my new living situation, whether I understand what happened to me, whether I'm receiving appropriate support during this difficult transition. And what do you tell them? I tell them the truth, darling, that my family made decisions they felt were necessary, and that I'm trying to accept those decisions with grace. Another long pause. Mother, if there was a way to modify some of the legal arrangements we made, would you be interested in discussing that? And there it was, the first sign that Sarah was beginning to understand that her perfect crime might not be as perfect as she thought. What kind of modifications? Maybe giving you more autonomy over day-to-day decisions, more access to your own funds for personal expenses, a chance to prove that you can manage some of your own affairs. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart, but I have to ask, why the sudden change of heart? No change of heart, Mother. We've always wanted what's best for you. If the current arrangements aren't working as well as we'd hoped, we're certainly willing to make adjustments. I see. And this wouldn't have anything to do with the internal affairs investigation, would it? The silence that followed was answer enough. Mother, I want you to know that everything we did was legal and appropriate, but sometimes legal procedures can be misunderstood by people who don't have the full information. I understand completely, darling. People do tend to jump to conclusions when they don't understand the full context of family decisions. Exactly. So, if there was a way to resolve any misunderstandings without unnecessary legal complications, that would probably be better for everyone involved. I'm sure it would be. Why don't you and Marcus come by this weekend? We can discuss what kinds of adjustments might be appropriate. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my small window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the conversation I'd just had. Sarah was scared. She could feel the walls closing in, even if she didn't yet understand how extensively those walls had been constructed or who had been building them. Her offer to modify our arrangements was essentially an admission that those arrangements had been improper in the first place. And her desperation to avoid unnecessary legal complications was evidence that she knew exactly how much trouble she was in if the truth came to light. The third crack appeared the next morning in the form of a newspaper article that made my coffee taste like liquid victory. Diana Foster's story ran on the front page of the Metro section under the headline, "Questions Raised About Elder Protection Procedures." It was a masterful piece of investigative journalism that managed to expose the entire conspiracy without naming specific victims or making accusations that couldn't be substantiated. Instead, Diana had focused on the statistical patterns, the unusual number of competency determinations involving Dr. Camden's evaluations, the speed with which these cases moved through the court system, the financial beneficiaries of guardianship arrangements, and the lack of oversight mechanisms to prevent abuse. She'd interviewed legal experts who expressed concern about procedural irregularities, family advocates who questioned the adequacy of current protection systems, and former court officials who suggested that the entire elder protection framework needed comprehensive review. Most importantly, she'd managed to include quotes from unnamed sources who had direct experience with the system and who described feeling pressured to accept legal arrangements that they didn't fully understand and couldn't afford to challenge. The article didn't accuse anyone of criminal behavior, but it painted a picture of a system that was ripe for exploitation and lacking in appropriate safeguards. By the time I finished reading, my phone was already ringing. "Willow, have you seen the paper this morning?" It was Margaret Thornton, her voice electric with excitement. "I was just reading it. Quite concerning, isn't it?" "Concerning? It's explosive. This is exactly what we've all been worried about, the systematic exploitation of elderly people under the guise of protection. I hope it leads to some kind of reform." "Oh, it will. Catherine Morrison called me 20 minutes ago. The DA's office is opening a formal investigation, and they're asking for anyone with relevant information. That's encouraging. Willow, you should contact them. Your case could be exactly the kind of concrete example they need to demonstrate that these aren't just theoretical concerns." "Do you really think so? I mean, I wouldn't want to cause trouble for Sarah." "Sarah is a public servant, darling. If she's been following proper procedures, an investigation will only confirm her professionalism. And if she hasn't," Margaret's voice carried the kind of steely determination that had made her husband's political career possible, "well, then she needs to face the consequences of her choices." After Margaret hung up, I sat in my small kitchen, surrounded by the modest furnishings of my temporary exile, and smiled with the satisfaction of a woman whose careful planning was finally bearing fruit. Sarah and Marcus had built their criminal enterprise on the assumption that their victims would be isolated, powerless, and too ashamed to fight back. They never considered the possibility that one of their victims might have spent decades building exactly the kind of network that could turn their perfect crime into their perfect destruction. The cracks in their fortress were spreading, and soon the entire structure would come crashing down. But I wasn't finished yet. The best part of any good revenge was watching your enemies realize exactly how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. And Sarah and Marcus were about to get a masterclass in that particular form of education. The call came at 7:23 a.m. on a Friday morning, jarring me from sleep with its urgent, relentless ringing. I reached for my phone with a groggy confusion of someone who'd been dreaming of better times, then came fully awake when I saw the caller ID. Sarah. Calling before 8 in the morning was unprecedented. She'd always been a night owl, barely functional before her second cup of coffee. "Mother." Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the underlying panic. "We have a problem." "Good morning to you too, darling. What kind of problem?" "The kind where I'm suspended from duty pending a full internal affairs investigation. The kind where Marcus just lost his biggest client because they don't want to be associated with someone under criminal investigation. The kind where a lawyer is telling us we need to prepare for multiple felony charges." I sat up in bed, pulling my silk robe around me with careful movements designed to hide my satisfaction. "Oh my, that sounds serious." "Don't play dumb with me, Mother. This is your doing." "Sarah, I'm legally incompetent to manage my own checkbook. How could I possibly orchestrate something as complex as a criminal investigation? You've been talking to people, spreading lies, making accusations, poisoning people against us." "I've been talking to friends who are concerned about my well-being. If their concern led them to ask questions about my situation, that's hardly my fault." The word came out like a whip crack, Sarah's professional composure finally cracking. "You've been planning this since the day we took custody of you. You've been systematically destroying our lives." "Sarah, Elizabeth Batcherin, I said, using her full name with the kind of maternal authority that transcended legal competency status. You will not use that language with me. The silence that followed was electric with tension. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had returned to its professional register, but I could hear the effort it cost her. Mother, we need to meet today. All of us, we need to discuss how to resolve this situation before it gets completely out of hand. I thought you said the legal process for reversing competency determinations was extremely difficult. This isn't about legal processes anymore. This is about survival. If these investigations continue, we could lose everything, not just the house and the assets, but our careers, our freedom, our entire future. That would be tragic. Don't you care at all about what happens to your own daughter? I paused, considering my response carefully. This was the moment I'd been building toward for months. The opportunity to let Sarah understand exactly what she'd cost herself when she'd chosen greed over love. Sarah, do you remember when you were 7 years old and you broke my grandmother's crystal vase? What? Mother, this isn't the time for childhood memories. You told me it was an accident, that you'd been playing ball in the house even though I told you not to, and the ball had knocked over the vase. Do you remember what I told you? I know. What does this have to do with anything? I told you that accidents could be forgiven, but lies made everything worse. That if you'd just told me from the beginning, we could have worked together to fix the problem. But because you lied about it, the broken vase became about more than just broken crystal. Mother, you didn't accidentally handcuff me in front of my neighbors. Sarah, you didn't accidentally force me to sign legal documents under duress. You didn't accidentally steal my house and my independence and my dignity. Those weren't accidents that could be forgiven. They were deliberate choices that had to be answered. We were protecting you. You were protecting yourselves from debts Marcus had accumulated, from financial problems you'd created, from the consequences of choices you'd made. And you decided that stealing from me was easier than facing those consequences honestly. Another silence, longer this time. What do you want? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I want my life back. I want my house back. I want the dignity you stole from me returned. And I want you to face the consequences of your choices, just like I taught you when you were 7 years old. And if we give you all of that, if we reverse everything, restore your legal status, return your assets, will you make this investigation go away? Sarah, even if I had the power to stop investigations that have already begun, which I don't, why would I do that? Because I'm your daughter. Yes, I said, my voice steady and cold. You are, and that makes what you did to me infinitely worse than if a stranger had done it. I hung up before she could respond, then sat in my small bedroom for several minutes, letting the reality of that conversation settle into my bones. It was the first time Sarah had acknowledged that what they'd done was wrong. The first time she'd admitted that their actions had been motivated by self-interest rather than concern for my well-being. And it was the first time she'd begged me for something instead of demanding it. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Michael Brennan. Willow, I have news. Good news from your perspective. Please tell me it involves legal documents being served. Better than that, it involves plea negotiations being opened. Sarah's attorney called me this morning asking about the possibility of resolving your civil case without going to trial. What kind of resolution are they proposing? Full restitution of all assets, reversal of the competency determination, and a substantial cash settlement for emotional damages, plus a public apology acknowledging that the guardianship was inappropriate. And in exchange, they want you to agree not to pursue criminal charges? I laughed, actually laughed at the audacity of the proposal. Michael, they seem to be under the impression that I have some control over the criminal investigation. That's what I told them. The DA's office is pursuing this case based on evidence of systematic fraud that extends far beyond your individual situation. Even if you refuse to cooperate, which you're not going to do, they have enough evidence from other victims to proceed. So their plea offer is essentially meaningless? Worse than meaningless. It's evidence that they know they're guilty and are desperately trying to limit the damage. What did you tell them? I told them we'd consider any reasonable offer, but that reasonable would need to include full accountability for their actions. Financial restitution is just the beginning. There needs to be professional consequences and legal consequences that reflect the severity of what they've done. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Marcus stood outside my apartment door, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 months. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, his usual arrogant confidence replaced by the desperate energy of someone who'd run out of options. "Willow, we need to talk." "I don't think that's appropriate, Marcus. You're not family, and you've never shown any particular interest in my well-being. Please, 5 minutes. Just let me explain what's really happening here." Against my better judgment, I let him in. He stood in my small living room, dwarfing the modest furniture, looking around at my reduced circumstances with something that might have been guilt. "This isn't what we intended," he said without preamble. "The whole guardianship thing, the asset protection, it was supposed to be temporary, just until we could get back on our feet financially." "I see. And my consent to this temporary arrangement? We thought you'd understand eventually, that you'd see we were just trying to protect the family assets during a difficult period. By stealing them. By managing them. Willow, I had debts. Serious debts to serious people. The kind of people who don't accept payment plans or listen to explanations about temporary financial difficulties. So you decided to make your debts my problem. We decided to use family resources to solve a family crisis. Sarah was convinced you'd forgive us once the immediate danger was over. I poured myself a glass of water, taking time to consider his words. He was essentially confessing to theft while trying to frame it as a family emergency loan. Marcus, did it ever occur to you to simply ask me for help? Would you have given it to us? I might have, especially if you'd been honest about the extent of your financial problems and your plan for resolving them. And if you'd said no, then you would have faced the consequences of your own choices instead of forcing me to face them. He sat down heavily on my small couch, his head in his hands. "Willow, they're talking about 20 years in prison. 20 years for what was supposed to be a temporary financial arrangement. They're talking about 20 years for systematic fraud, theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The temporary nature of your intentions doesn't change the criminal nature of your actions. But you could help us if you testified that we had your consent, that you understood what was happening. Marcus, are you asking me to commit perjury? I'm asking you to help your daughter avoid destroying her life over a mistake. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated decision to steal from someone you thought was vulnerable enough to victimize without consequences. The only mistake you made was choosing the wrong victim." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Genuine fear. "What do you want from us, Willow? What would it take for you to help us minimize the damage?" "I want you to face the consequences of your choices. I want other potential victims to see that this kind of behavior has a price, and I want you to understand that actions have consequences, even when, especially when, those actions are committed against people you think can't fight back. You're going to destroy your own daughter's life over money. Sarah destroyed her own life when she put handcuffs on her mother for the crime of owning assets she wanted to steal. I'm just making sure the rest of the world understands what kind of person would do that to their own family." Marcus left without another word, and I watched him walk away with the satisfaction of knowing that my enemies were finally beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. That evening, I received one more call. "Mrs. Becker, this is District Attorney Catherine Morrison. I was wondering if you'd be available to meet with me and my senior prosecutor tomorrow morning. We'd like to discuss your cooperation with our ongoing investigation. Of course, Mrs. Morrison. I'm always happy to assist law enforcement in any way I can. Excellent. And Mrs. Becker, I want you to know that what happened to you is unacceptable, and we're going to make sure it never happens to anyone else. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. After I hung up, I opened a bottle of wine, a better vintage than my budget typically allowed, but this was a celebration worth the expense. The first blow had been struck, and my enemies were reeling. Sarah was suspended, Marcus was losing clients, and their attorney was making desperate plea offers that demonstrated just how weak their legal position really was. But this was only the beginning. The criminal investigation would take months to complete, and every day of that investigation would bring new revelations, new evidence, and new opportunities for their victims to come forward. I raised my glass to the window, toasting the city lights that twinkled below like stars in a constellation of justice. Tomorrow, I would meet with the district attorney and provide whatever assistance the prosecution needed to build their case. But tonight, I would savor the knowledge that my daughter and her husband were finally learning the lesson I should have taught them years ago. Some people fight back, and some people fight back with the kind of patience, planning, and precision that turns their enemies' victories into their ultimate destruction. Beautiful souls. Did you feel that shift? That moment when Willow went from victim to victor? Sarah and Marcus are scrambling now, begging and pleading, trying to undo what they've done. But it's too late. The wheels of justice are turning, and there's no stopping them now. If you're getting that sweet taste of satisfaction, that feeling that karma is finally coming home to roost, then you need to subscribe right now, because the next chapter is going to show you what happens when the full weight of the law comes crashing down on people who thought they were untouchable. The morning of my meeting with District Attorney Catherine Morrison, I dressed with the same care I'd once taken for board meetings and charity galas, a navy blue suit that spoke of authority, pearls that whispered of respectability, and makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that first impressions could determine outcomes. I wanted to look like what I was, a competent, intelligent woman who had been systematically victimized by people who had underestimated her capacity for strategic thinking. The DA's office occupied an entire floor of the downtown courthouse, its institutional gray walls and fluorescent lighting designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Catherine Morrison's corner office was different. Warm wood furniture, law school diplomas, and photographs that suggested a woman who had fought her way to the top of a male-dominated profession. "Mrs. Backer," she said, rising from behind her desk to shake my hand, "thank you for coming in. I know this situation has been difficult for you." "Thank you for taking it seriously, Miss Morrison. Too many people seem to think that elder abuse is just a family matter that shouldn't involve law enforcement." She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, where a stack of files suggested that our conversation would be more substantial than a courtesy meeting. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "What happened to you appears to be part of a larger criminal pattern of behavior that has been going on for several years. We're not just talking about one incident of poor judgment. We're talking about systematic fraud that has victimized at least 30 elderly citizens." 30 that you know of? Exactly. And that's why your cooperation is so important. You're the first victim who has had the resources and the knowledge to fight back effectively. Your case could be the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. Over the next 2 hours, I provided detailed testimony about everything that had happened since that morning in September when Sarah had appeared at my door with handcuffs. I described the physical coercion, the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, the forced signing of legal documents, and the systematic isolation that had followed. But more importantly, I provided context about the other cases I discovered during my research, patterns of behavior that connected my situation to a broader criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Backer," Catherine said as our formal interview concluded, I need to ask you something that might be uncomfortable. Are you prepared for the media attention that's going to come with this case? What kind of media attention? The kind where your daughter's arrest will be front page news. The kind where reporters will want to interview you about being victimized by your own family. The kind where your personal business becomes public consumption. I smiled with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for months. Miss Morrison, I've spent the last 5 months having my personal business discussed in whispers at country clubs and church socials. I've been the subject of gossip about my mental competence, my financial decisions, and my family relationships. At this point, having those conversations happen in public with actual facts instead of speculation sounds like an improvement. Even if it means testifying against your own daughter? Sarah stopped being my daughter the moment she put handcuffs on me for the crime of owning assets she wanted to steal. Now she's just another criminal who needs to face the consequences of her choices. Catherine nodded with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who had just secured a cooperative witness with unshakable resolve. In that case, Mrs. Backer, let's talk about the press conference we're planning for tomorrow afternoon. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. on the courthouse steps with representatives from every major news outlet in the state expected to attend. Catherine had orchestrated it perfectly. Late enough in the day to make the evening news, early enough to ensure maximum coverage in the next morning's papers. I spent that evening reviewing the statement Catherine's office had prepared, making small adjustments to ensure that my words would carry the maximum emotional impact while remaining legally appropriate. The next morning, Diana Foster called me. Willow, I wanted to give you a heads up. My follow-up story is running tomorrow, and it's going to name names. The investigation has advanced far enough that we can report specific allegations against specific people. How specific? Specific enough that Sarah Chun and Marcus Chun are going to wake up tomorrow morning to find their names and photographs on the front page, along with details about their criminal enterprise and their victims. All of their victims. Everyone we can identify. 37, Willow. 37 elderly citizens who were systematically defrauded by her daughter and her husband. The total amount stolen is over $8 million. I sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the scope of what Sarah and Marcus had accomplished. My $1.6 million house had just been one score in a criminal career that had destroyed dozens of families. Diana, when that story runs, they're going to know it's over. Yes, they are. And more importantly, every other potential victim in the state is going to know that this kind of behavior has consequences. At 2 p.m., I stood beside Catherine Morrison on the courthouse steps, facing a crowd of reporters and camera crews that stretched halfway across the plaza. The autumn sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine began, today we are announcing the indictment of Sarah Chun, a sergeant with the Metropolitan Police Department, and her husband, Marcus Chun, on charges including elder abuse, financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of civil rights under color of law. The cameras clicked and whirred as she outlined the scope of the investigation, the number of victims identified, and the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise. These individuals use Sergeant Chun's position as a police officer to target vulnerable elderly citizens, subjecting them to fraudulent competency evaluations and forced guardianship arrangements that resulted in the theft of millions of dollars and assets. Then it was my turn. My name is Willow Backer, I said, stepping forward to the microphone. 5 months ago, I was a 58-year-old woman living independently in my own home, managing my own finances, and enjoying my retirement. Today, I am here to tell you what happened when my own daughter decided to steal my life was easier than asking for my help. I described that morning in September when Sarah had handcuffed me in my own driveway, the humiliation of being forced to sign legal documents under duress, and the months of exile that had followed. But I also want you to know that I am not just a victim. I am a woman who fought back. I am someone who refused to accept that being elderly made me powerless. And I am here today to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. The questions from reporters were sharp and direct. Mrs. Backer, how does it feel to testify against your own daughter? It feels like justice. Sarah made a choice to commit crimes against vulnerable people. The fact that one of those people was her mother doesn't make those crimes less serious. It makes them more serious. Do you believe your daughter can be rehabilitated? I believe my daughter can face the consequences of her choices and learn from them just like any other criminal. Whether she chooses to be rehabilitated is up to her. What do you want other families to learn from your experience? I want them to learn that elder abuse is a crime, not a family matter. I want them to learn that having power over someone doesn't give you the right to exploit them. And I want them to learn that some people fight back, no matter how old they are or how powerless they might seem. The press conference lasted 45 minutes, and by the time it ended, I knew that Sarah and Marcus's world was about to change dramatically. That evening, I watched the coverage from my small apartment, seeing my own face on every local news channel, and knowing that by morning, the story would be picked up by national outlets. But the most satisfying moment came at 11 p.m. when my phone rang. "Mother, please, you have to stop this." Sarah's voice was barely recognizable, raw, desperate, broken. "Stop what, darling?" "The media circus, the public humiliations. You've made your point. Now please just make it stop." "Sarah, I didn't create this media circus. I simply told the truth about what you did to me. If that truth is causing you public humiliation, perhaps you should have considered that possibility before you handcuffed your mother in front of her neighbors. We'll give you everything back. The house, the money, all of it. We'll reverse the guardianship, restore your legal status, pay for damages. Just please stop destroying our lives." "I'm not destroying your lives, Sarah. I'm revealing your lives. There's a difference. Marcus is talking about suicide, the stress, the shame, the knowledge that we're going to prison. He can't handle it." Then, perhaps Marcus should have considered those consequences before he decided to steal from elderly people for a living. How can you be so cold? How can you care so little about what happens to us? I paused, considering my response carefully. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the opportunity to explain to Sarah exactly what she'd lost when she'd chosen theft over truth. "Sarah, do you remember when you were 12 years old and you wanted to go to summer camp?" "What? Mother, this isn't the time for—" "You remember the expensive camp that all your friends were attending? We couldn't afford it that year because your father had just lost his job, but you begged me to find a way to make it work." "I remember. Do you remember what I told you?" You said that if something was really important to me, we'd find a way to make it work. That family helped family no matter what." "And do you remember what I did?" You took a second job. I cleaned offices at night so you could earn the money for camp. I worked 16-hour days for 3 months so my daughter could have something that mattered to her. Because that's what mothers do for their children. They sacrifice for them, they protect them, they put their children's needs ahead of their own comfort. Mother, now I want you to tell me, Sarah, when you needed money, when you were in financial trouble, when you were facing serious consequences for Marcus's debts, did you come to me and ask for help? Silence. Did you explain your situation and ask if there was a way for family to help family? We thought you thought it would be easier to steal from me than to ask me for help. You thought I was old and vulnerable and wouldn't be able to fight back. We were desperate. I was desperate when I worked 16-hour days to send you to summer camp, but I didn't steal from someone else to solve my problem. I made sacrifices, and I found honest solutions. This is different. You're right. This is different. Because when I needed to help my child, I worked harder. When you needed money, you committed crimes. That's the difference between us, Sarah. That's why I'm standing on courthouse steps talking to reporters, and you're hiding in shame, waiting for your arrest. I hung up before she could respond. then sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the modest furnishings of my temporary exile, and felt the deep satisfaction of a lesson finally taught. The next morning, Diana Foster's story filled the entire front page of the newspaper, with Sarah and Marcus's photographs prominently displayed above a headline that read, "Police Sergeant and Husband Charged in $8 million Elder Abuse Scheme." The article was devastating in its thoroughness, naming every victim who had agreed to be identified, detailing the methods used to target and exploit vulnerable seniors, and describing the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise. But the most damaging element was the sidebar story titled Daughter's Betrayal, which focused specifically on my case and included quotes from neighbors who described watching me being handcuffed in my own driveway. By noon, my phone was ringing constantly with interview requests from national news outlets. By evening, the story was trending on social media, with thousands of comments expressing outrage at Sarah and Marcus's actions and support for my decision to fight back. The public exposure was complete. Sarah and Marcus Toon were no longer anonymous criminals operating in the shadows. They were the public face of elder abuse. Their names and photographs permanently associated with the systematic exploitation of vulnerable seniors. And tomorrow, they would be arrested. But first, they would have to endure one more night of knowing that their perfect crime had become their perfect destruction, and that the woman they had thought was too old and powerless to fight back had orchestrated every moment of their downfall with the precision of someone who had been planning their destruction since the moment they underestimated her. Some lessons, I reflected as I watched the evening news coverage of my press conference, could only be learned through public humiliation. And Sarah and Marcus were about to graduate summa cum laude from that particular school of education. Oh my God, beautiful souls. Did you see that? Willow just served justice ice cold on national television. Sarah went from powerful police officer to desperate criminal begging her mother for mercy. And Willow showed exactly zero sympathy for the woman who put handcuffs on her own mother. If you're feeling that righteous satisfaction, that perfect moment when karma finally comes home to roost, then you better hit subscribe and share the story with everyone you know. The next chapter is going to show you what happens when the handcuffs are on the other wrist. The arrests came at dawn, precisely as Catherine Morrison had promised they would. I watched the coverage from my apartment, sipping coffee from my modest ceramic mug, while news helicopters circled overhead and reporters described the dramatic early morning raids that had taken Sarah and Marcus into custody. The images were perfect in their irony. Sarah, still in her pajamas, being led away in handcuffs by her former colleagues. Marcus, disheveled and disoriented, stumbling as he was guided into the back of a police car. Both of them experiencing the same helpless humiliation they had inflicted on dozens of elderly victims. Sergeant Sarah Chun and her husband Marcus Chun were arrested this morning on multiple felony charges, the news anchor announced, as footage rolled of my beautiful former home being cordoned off with crime scene tape. Authorities are conducting searches of their residence and business premises as part of an ongoing investigation into what prosecutors are calling one of the largest elder abuse conspiracies in state history. My phone rang before the news segment ended. Willow, it's Michael. Have you been watching every moment of it? Good, because we need to talk about the asset forfeit proceedings. The government is moving to seize everything Sarah and Marcus acquired through their criminal enterprise, including your house. My house that they stole from me? Exactly. Which means we need to file an immediate motion to exclude your property from the forfeit as belonging to a victim rather than a criminal. How long will that take with the evidence we have? Probably about 30 days. The government wants to return stolen assets to their rightful owners as quickly as possible. It makes their prosecution look more sympathetic to juries. 30 days? After 5 months of exile, I would have to wait just 30 more days to reclaim my home. But the financial devastation of Sarah and Marcus would begin immediately. Michael, what about their other assets? The investments, the cars, the luxury items they bought with stolen money, all of it will be seized. The government has already frozen their bank accounts and placed liens on their personal property. As of this morning, they have access to exactly nothing. What will they live on? Whatever their families can provide, assuming their families want to associate with accused felons. Otherwise, they'll be depending on public defenders and whatever charity they can find. The irony was exquisite. Sarah and Marcus had forced me into financial dependence, stripping away my resources and reducing me to living on the modest allowance they decided I deserved. Now they would experience that same helplessness, that same humiliation of having to beg for basic necessities, while their former wealth was cataloged and redistributed to their victims. Over the next week, I followed their financial destruction with the attention of someone watching a particularly satisfying chess match reach its inevitable conclusion. The government's asset seizure was swift and comprehensive. The BMW Marcus had been so proud of, repossessed and towed away, while news cameras captured every moment. The expensive jewelry Sarah had accumulated, removed from their house by federal marshals and tagged as evidence. The vacation home they had purchased with stolen funds, seized and scheduled for auction. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Marcus's former clients. Willow. Michael called me on Thursday morning, his voice electric with satisfaction. "You're going to love this. Marcus's construction company just lost every major contract they had because of the criminal charges, because of the morality clauses in their contracts. Apparently, when you're building luxury developments for wealthy clients, being arrested for stealing from elderly people is considered a significant breach of trust." How significant? $8 million in canceled contracts, plus penalty clauses for projects that will now have to be completed by other contractors. Marcus is looking at personal liability that will exceed anything they could possibly pay, even if they weren't already broke. The financial bloodletting was so thorough that I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then I remembered the morning Sarah had handcuffed me in my own driveway, and my sympathy evaporated like morning mist. The criminal case moved forward with the inexorable momentum of a system that had finally found defendants worth prosecuting. The grand jury returned indictments on 17 separate charges, including racketeering, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. But the civil lawsuits were even more devastating. Willow, Michael announced during one of our weekly meetings, we now have 43 plaintiffs in our class action suit. 43 victims with documented losses totaling over $12 million. $12 million. And that's just what we can prove. The actual amount is probably much higher, but some victims died before we could document their cases, and others are too ashamed to come forward. What kind of settlement are we looking at? Settlement, Willow? We're not settling. We're going to trial, and we're going to win every penny we can extract from these people, plus punitive damages that will ensure they never financially recover from what they've done. Even if they don't have the money to pay, they'll get jobs, minimum wage jobs probably, since their professional reputations are destroyed. And for the rest of their lives, every paycheck they earn will be garnished to pay back restitution to their victims. The prospect of Sarah and Marcus working at minimum wage jobs while their paychecks were garnished to pay back the people they had robbed was almost too perfect to believe. 2 weeks after their arrest, I received an unexpected phone call. "Mrs. Backer, this is Linda Chun, Marcus's mother. I was wondering if I could speak with you." I paused, considering whether I wanted to engage with Marcus's family. Ultimately, curiosity won. "Of course, Mrs. Chun, what can I do for you?" "I wanted to apologize for what my son did to you, for the pain he's caused your family, for the shame he's brought on all of us." "That's very kind of you to say, Mrs. Backer. I need you to know that Marcus wasn't raised to behave this way. His father and I taught him to respect his elders, to work hard for what he wanted, to treat people with dignity and kindness." "I'm sure you did your best, Mrs. Chun." "We did. But somewhere along the way, he lost his moral compass. The gambling, the debts, the desperation. It changed him into someone we didn't recognize." "Mrs. Chun, are you asking me to show mercy during sentencing?" "I'm asking you to remember that he has a family who loves him, parents who are ashamed of what he's done, but who still hope he can somehow make amends for his crimes." I sat in silence for a moment, thinking about the pain in this woman's voice. She was suffering for her son's choices, just as I had suffered for my daughter's choices. Mrs. Chun, I appreciate your call, and I'm sorry for the pain your family is experiencing. But I want you to understand something. Marcus didn't just steal money from me. He stole my dignity, my independence, my sense of safety in my own home. He handcuffed me like a criminal and forced me to sign away my life's work. I know, and there's no excuse for that. You're right, there isn't. And that's why he's going to face the full consequences of his choices. Not because I'm vindictive, but because what he did was unforgivable. I understand. Mrs. Chun, I hope your son learns from this experience. I hope he becomes the man you raised him to be. But that learning needs to happen in prison, surrounded by the consequences of his choices, not through the mercy of his victims. After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment and thought about the ripple effects of Sarah and Marcus's crimes. Their actions hadn't just destroyed their victims, they had devastated their own families, ruined their own futures, and created pain that would last for generations. But that was what happened when you built your life on other people's suffering. Eventually, the foundation crumbled, and everything you'd constructed came crashing down. My phone rang again. This time, it was Sarah. Mother, please, I'm begging you. We'll plead guilty to everything. We'll accept whatever prison sentence they offer, but please don't testify at the sentencing hearing. Why not? Because every word you say will add years to our sentences. The judge will see you as the sympathetic victim, and she'll want to punish us as severely as possible. Sarah, you're going to be punished severely. That's the point of a criminal justice system. But it doesn't have to be as severe as possible. You could ask for mercy. You could talk about redemption and second chances. You could help us get shorter sentences. And why would I do that? Because I'm your daughter, because you loved me once, because somewhere inside you there has to be some part that wants to see me have a chance at rebuilding my life. I considered her words carefully. There was a part of me, a small, quiet part, that mourned for the daughter I had raised, the little girl who had once curled up in my lap during thunderstorms and told me I was the best mother in the world. But that little girl had grown up to become a woman who put handcuffs on her mother for money. Sarah, do you remember what you told me when you were handcuffing me? Mother, you said it was for my own good. You said you were protecting me from my own core judgment. Do you remember that? Yes. Well, testifying at your sentencing hearing will be for your own good. I'll be protecting you from the possibility that you might not fully understand the consequences of your choices. Consider it my final gift to you as your mother, the certainty that you will have plenty of time in prison to think about what you've done and who you want to be when you get out. That's not a gift. That's revenge. No, Sarah. Revenge would have been handcuffing you in front of your neighbors and forcing you to sign away your freedom. What I'm doing is called justice. There is a difference, though. I understand why you might not recognize it. I hung up and returned to my coffee, watching the morning news coverage of their ongoing financial ruin with the satisfaction of someone who had learned that patience and planning were far more effective than anger and impulse. Tomorrow, Michael would file our motion to reclaim my house. Next week, the asset auctions would begin liquidating everything Sarah and Marcus had accumulated through their crimes. And in 3 months, I would stand before a judge and explain exactly why my daughter and her husband deserved every year of the prison sentences they were about to receive. Some lessons could only be learned through complete and total destruction. And Sarah and Marcus were about to become honor students in that particular curriculum. Beautiful souls, the financial karma is hitting harder than a freight train. Sarah and Marcus went from millionaire criminals to minimum wage felons faster than you can say justice served. Can you believe Sarah had the audacity to ask her victim mother for mercy? If you're loving this complete and total destruction of two people who thought they were untouchable, then you need to subscribe right now and share the story because we're heading into the final chapters where Willow reclaims her throne. The day of Sarah and Marcus's sentencing arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn clarity that made everything seem possible. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit, professional, dignified, and expensive enough to remind everyone in the courtroom that I was a woman of substance who had been systematically victimized by people who should have protected me rather than cause it. The courthouse was packed with reporters, victim families, and the merely curious who had been following the case through months of sensational media coverage. Sarah and Marcus sat at the defendant's table with their court-appointed attorneys, both of them looking like shadows of their former selves. Sarah had lost weight during her months in jail awaiting trial, her once proud posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who had learned what it felt like to be powerless. Marcus looked older, grayer, defeated in a way that suggested he had finally understood the full scope of what his choices had cost him. Judge Patricia Holloway presided with the kind of stern authority that came from decades of seeing humanity at its worst and still believing in the possibility of justice. Before we proceed to sentencing, Judge Holloway announced, the court will hear victim impact statements. I understand we have several people who wish to address the court today. I was the first to speak. I walked to the podium with measured steps, my statement carefully prepared, but my emotions entirely genuine. The courtroom fell silent as I arranged my papers and looked directly at Sarah and Marcus. Your Honor, my name is Willow Backer, and I am here to tell you about the morning my daughter destroyed my life. For the next 15 minutes, I described that September morning when Sarah had handcuffed me in my own driveway, the months of exile that had followed, and the systematic theft of everything I had worked 40 years to accumulate. But I also talked about something more fundamental. The betrayal of trust that occurred when someone who was supposed to love and protect you instead chose to exploit and victimize you. Your Honor, Sarah Chin didn't just steal my money. She stole my faith and family, my sense of security in my own home, and my belief that the people who claimed to love me would protect me from harm rather than cause it. I turned to look directly at Sarah, who is crying silently at the defendant's table. Sarah, you told me that what you were doing was for my own good. Today, I want you to understand that what I am doing is for your own good, because the only way you will ever become the person you were raised to be is if you face the full consequences of the person you chose to become. I returned to my seat knowing that I had said everything that needed to be said. 5 other victims followed me to the podium, each telling their own story of betrayal and loss. Mrs. Eleanor Carrington's son spoke about watching his mother die alone and confused in state custody while her assets were liquidated. Mr. Robert Martinez's daughter described the depression and despair that had consumed her father after he'd been declared incompetent and separated from his lifelong home. By the time the victims' statements were complete, several jurors were crying, and Sarah and Marcus looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Holloway reviewed the sentencing guidelines with clinical precision, weighing the severity of the crimes against the defendants' lack of prior criminal history and their expressions of remorse. The court finds that the defendants engaged in a systematic pattern of criminal behavior that targeted some of our community's most vulnerable citizens, she announced. These crimes were not impulsive acts of desperation, but calculated decisions to exploit trust and abuse authority for personal financial gain. She turned to address Sarah directly. Sergeant Chin, you took an oath to protect and serve the citizens of this community. Instead, you used your badge and your authority to target elderly citizens for financial exploitation. You violated not only the law, but the fundamental trust that makes civil society possible. Mr. Marcus Chun, you served as the operational coordinator of this criminal enterprise, using your charm and apparent respectability to gain access to victims and execute the fraudulent schemes that your wife's position made possible. Judge Holloway paused, consulting her notes one final time. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that Sarah Chin be sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Marcus Chun will be sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. 22 years for Sarah? 18 years for Marcus? Sentences that would effectively end their productive adult lives and ensure they would emerge from prison as elderly people themselves. Additionally, Judge Holloway continued, the defendants are jointly and severally liable for restitution in the amount of $12.4 million to their identified victims, plus attorney fees and court costs. $12 million they would never be able to pay on salaries they would never be able to earn for crimes they would spend the rest of their lives regretting. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, Sarah, crying openly now, Marcus staring straight ahead with the empty expression of someone whose spirit had been completely broken, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice had been served, with the kind of thoroughness that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider victimizing vulnerable seniors. Sadness because the daughter I had raised, the little girl who had once trusted me to protect her from the world's cruelties, had become someone who needed to be protected from herself. After the sentencing, I stood on the courthouse steps with Catherine Morrison, answering questions from reporters who wanted to know how it felt to see my own daughter sentenced to decades in prison. It feels like the end of a very long and difficult chapter, I said. Sarah and Marcus made choices that hurt dozens of families. Today, they learned that choices have consequences, even when those choices are made by people you love. Do you feel any regret about your role in their prosecution? I feel regret that it was necessary. I feel regret that my daughter chose crime over honesty, theft over asking for help, exploitation over compassion, but I feel no regret about ensuring that their victims received justice. What's next for you, Mrs. Backer? Next, I'm going home. To my real home, the one I should never have been forced to leave. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. That evening, I received a call from Michael Brennan. Willow, I have news. The asset forfeiture proceedings are complete, and all the seized properties are being returned to their rightful owners, including your house, especially your house. You can move back in whenever you're ready. What about the other victims? Everyone who can be identified is getting their stolen assets returned. The people who died before we could resolve their cases, their estates will receive the restitution. It's not perfect justice, but it's as close as the legal system can provide. I hung up and walked to my small window, looking out at the city lights that had become familiar during my months of exile. Tomorrow, I would leave this cramped apartment behind and return to the home that had been stolen from me. But I wouldn't be the same woman who had left that house in handcuffs 6 months ago. I had learned things about myself, about justice, and about the price of underestimating the wrong person. My phone rang one final time that evening. Mother. Sarah's voice was small, broken, calling from the jail where she would spend her last night before being transported to federal prison. Yes, Sarah. I want you to know that I'm sorry for all of it. For what I did to you, for what I did to all those people, for the person I became. I know you are, dear. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was a complex thing, especially when it involves someone who had systematically betrayed every bond of trust and love. Sarah, I forgive the little girl who made mistakes and learned from them. I forgive the teenager who sometimes chose poorly, but accepted the consequences. I even forgive the young woman who struggled with difficult decisions and occasionally needed guidance. And the woman who handcuffed her mother? That woman will spend the next 22 years learning who she wants to be when she grows up. When she figures that out, we can discuss forgiveness. Will you visit me? Sarah, you took away my home, my independence, my dignity, and my sense of safety in the world. You'll serve your sentence, and you'll think about what you've done. And maybe someday you'll become someone worthy of a mother's love again. But that day is not today, and it won't be tomorrow. I understand. I hope you do. And Sarah, when you get out of prison, if you've learned what you needed to learn, we can talk about rebuilding our relationship. But it will be a new relationship built on honesty and respect, not the old one built on assumptions about family loyalty that you've proven don't apply to you. I hung up and poured myself a glass of wine, a good vintage, the kind I'd be able to afford again now that my assets were being returned. Outside my window, the city lights twinkled like stars in a constellation of possibility. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new chapter, one where I reclaimed not just my house, but my faith in the idea that justice was possible, even when it took patience and planning and the kind of strategic thinking that turned apparent defeat into ultimate victory. Some stories, I reflected as I raised my glass to the night sky, had endings that were more satisfying than any beginning could promise. This was one of those stories. And the most satisfying part was knowing that Sarah and Marcus would spend the next 20 decades thinking about how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered by a woman they thought was too old and powerless to fight back. Some lessons could only be learned through total defeat, and I had been an excellent teacher. Moving day arrived with the kind of golden October sunshine that made everything look like a promise fulfilled. I stood in the driveway of my reclaimed home, watching professional movers carry my modest belongings past the crime scene tape that had finally been removed, past the perfectly manicured gardens that had somehow survived 6 months of neglect, past the memories of handcuffs and humiliation that would forever mark this threshold. But I wasn't the same woman who had been forced to leave this house in defeat. The woman returning was harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might mistake her grace for weakness. Mrs. Backer, the moving supervisor, approached with a clipboard and the kind of respectful deference that came from knowing he was working for someone who had become moderately famous for destroying her own daughter's criminal career. "Where would you like us to put the new furniture?" I smiled at the phrase "new furniture." While my legal assets had been frozen during the investigation, Michael Brennan had arranged for me to receive advance payments from the civil lawsuit settlements. The money that Sarah and Marcus had stolen from other victims was being used to purchase the luxuries Bay had cost me. It was poetic justice at its finest. The master bedroom suite goes upstairs, the new living room furniture in the front parlor, and the dining room set where you'd expect it to go, I told him. And please be careful with the crystal. It's Waterford and it's irreplaceable. Because if I was reclaiming my throne, I was going to do it with style. Over the next week, I transformed my recovered house into something that exceeded even its former glory. Professional designers working with an unlimited budget provided by civil settlement money created interiors that whispered wealth and power in every detail. The new security system included cameras, motion sensors, and direct connections to both the police department and a private security firm. Never again would anyone approach my front door with malicious intent without being observed and recorded. The new safe room, hidden behind a bookshelf in my study, contained copies of every document related to my legal victory, along with enough cash and supplies to survive any future attempts at harassment or intimidation. And the new office, equipped with multiple computers and communication systems, would serve as the headquarters for my new mission in life, ensuring that no other elderly person would ever experience what Sarah and Marcus had done to me. "Willow," Michael called me on Friday afternoon, "I have some final numbers on the settlement distributions. Please tell me they're substantial." 43 victims are receiving full restitution, totaling $4.2 million. Your personal settlement, including damages for emotional distress and loss of dignity, comes to $3.2 million. $3 million more than I'd had before Sarah and Marcus had stolen from me. Their crime had actually increased my wealth while destroying their own lives. An outcome so perfectly ironic that I had to admire the universe's sense of poetic justice. What about the ongoing garnishment of their future earnings? That will continue for the rest of their lives. Every job they get when they're released from prison, every paycheck they earn will be subject to restitution payments. They'll essentially be working for their victims until the day they die. And their appeals denied at every level. The convictions are final, the sentences are being served, and there's no legal mechanism for reducing their obligations to their victims. I hung up and walked through my beautiful home, admiring the way afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that I would never again fear losing. Every room had been restored to perfection, but more than that, every room had been improved beyond what it had been before my temporary exile. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 6 months. I invited people over. Not a party exactly, but an informal gathering of the friends and allies who had supported me through the darkest period of my life. Margaret Thornton, who had used her social connections to spread awareness of elder abuse issues, Judge Patricia Holloway, who had ensured that justice was served with appropriate severity, Detective Rachel Martinez, whose investigation had exposed the full scope of Sarah and Marcus's crimes, and Diana Foster, whose journalistic coverage had turned my personal tragedy into a public crusade for justice. "Willow," Diana said as we stood on my restored patio, sipping champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. "I have to ask, was this outcome what you were planning from the beginning?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, did you always know that your patient, methodical response would be more devastating than any immediate retaliation could have been?" I considered the question. While watching the sunset paint my garden in shades of gold and crimson, the roses were blooming again, their fragrance carrying on the evening breeze like a promise of renewal. "Diana, when Sarah handcuffed me in my own driveway, I had a choice. I could have screamed, fought, demanded immediate justice through whatever channels were available to me. Or I could have smiled, accepted what was happening, and used their assumption of victory against them." "So you chose the long game." "I chose to teach them a lesson they would never forget. That actions have consequences, that some people fight back, and that underestimating the wrong woman is always a fatal mistake." And now? Now they're in federal prison, facing decades of incarceration and a lifetime of financial servitude to their victims. I'm in my beautiful home, financially secure beyond my previous dreams, and surrounded by friends who respect my intelligence, rather than dismissing me as a helpless elderly woman. Do you ever feel guilty about the severity of their punishment? I paused, genuinely considering the question. Did I feel guilty about Sarah and Marcus's destruction? Did some part of me regret the thoroughness with which I had dismantled their lives? Diana, do you feel guilty when you expose corrupt politicians? When your investigations lead to prison sentences and ruined careers? No, because those people chose to commit crimes that hurt innocent victims. Exactly. Sarah and Marcus weren't unlucky victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were criminals who systematically exploited vulnerable people for years. The only thing I'm guilty of is ensuring that their victims received justice. Later that evening, after my guests had departed and I was alone in my reclaimed kingdom, I walked through each room slowly, appreciating the silence and the security of knowing that no one could ever again force me from my home. In my study, I opened a new file folder, one that would contain information about other potential cases of elder abuse, other vulnerable seniors who might need an advocate with experience in fighting back against those who would exploit them. Because my victory over Sarah and Marcus was complete, but my mission was just beginning. The phone system I'd had installed included a dedicated line for what I was calling the Backer Elder Justice Project, a private initiative to identify and combat systematic abuse of senior citizens throughout the state. I already had my first case. An 82-year-old retired teacher whose nephew had convinced her to sign over power of attorney and was systematically liquidating her assets for his own benefit. Some people, I'd learned, never stopped making the same mistakes. They saw elderly people as easy targets, vulnerable victims who could be exploited without consequences. They had no idea that some elderly people had connections, resources, and the kind of patient intelligence that could turn any attack into the attacker's ultimate destruction. My phone rang at exactly 9 p.m., a call I'd been expecting. "Mrs. Backer, this is Correctional Officer Williams at the Federal Correctional Institution. I'm calling because inmate Sarah Chun has requested to speak with you." "I see. And what did you tell her?" "That she would need to follow proper procedures for approved contact lists, but she was quite insistent that I call you personally." "Officer Williams, please inform Ms. Chun that she was removed from my approved contact list the day she was sentenced. If she wishes to communicate with me, she can do so through her attorney or through written correspondence that I am free to ignore." "Yes, ma'am. Should I expect any changes to that policy in the future?" "You should expect that policy to remain in effect for the duration of her incarceration. Sarah Chun is no longer my daughter. She's just another convicted felon who will serve her time and face the consequences of her choices." "Understood, ma'am." I hung up and poured myself a final glass of wine, then walked to my bedroom windows, which offered a view of the neighborhood where I'd lived for 20 years. The houses were lit with warm, welcoming light, their windows glowing like eyes watching over a community where families gathered for dinner, children played in safe yards, and elderly residents could live with dignity and security. It was exactly the kind of community that people like Sarah and Marcus threatened with their exploitation and abuse. And it was exactly the kind of community that needed people like me to ensure that predators faced appropriate consequences. I raised my glass to the window, toasting not just my own victory, but the promise I was making to every other potential victim in the state. "To justice," I said aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the silence of my beautiful home, and to the certainty that some people always fight back. Outside, the neighborhood settled into peaceful evening routines, unaware that their most formidable protector was standing at her bedroom window, planning her next campaign in the war against those who would exploit the vulnerable. Sarah and Marcus had taught me that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, more patient than I had ever needed to be, and more dangerous than anyone had ever suspected. Now, I was going to use those lessons to ensure that their story became a cautionary tale that echoed through every conversation about elder abuse, every discussion of family loyalty, and every assumption about what happened when criminals chose the wrong victim. Some women accepted defeat gracefully. Others turned defeat into the foundation for victories that their enemies could never have imagined. I had chosen to be the second kind of woman, and tomorrow I would begin teaching that lesson to the next person foolish enough to underestimate the power of a woman who had learned exactly what she was capable of when properly motivated. The queen had returned to her throne, and her reign would be legendary. Beautiful souls, I'm sobbing. Willow didn't just get her life back, she got a better life. Can you believe this incredible journey from victim to victor? From handcuffs in her driveway to champagne in her mansion? From powerless elderly woman to the most feared advocate for justice in the state? If this story gave you every emotion possible and left you feeling like justice really can prevail, then you need to subscribe to Her Voice Story right now. This woman showed us that age is just a number, that patience is more powerful than anger, and that strategic thinking can destroy any enemy stupid enough to underestimate you. Hit that subscribe button. Share the story with every woman who needs to remember her own power. And let us know in the comments, are you Team Willow all the way? Sarah and Marcus thought they were stealing from a helpless old lady. Instead, they handed the keys to their own destruction to the most dangerous woman they'd ever meet. Remember the story the next time someone tries to tell you that you're too old, too weak, or too powerless to fight back. Willow Backer proved that the most dangerous enemy is the one who smiles while you're destroying yourself. Until next time, beautiful souls, never let anyone dim your light. And always remember that the best revenge is living so well that your enemies can only dream of the life you've built on the ashes of their mistakes. This has been another incredible story from Her Voice Story. And trust me, we have more jaw-dropping tales of triumph coming your way.